I'm more than happy to do it for Aspen, and I'm especially happy to do it with Michael. I think of this as a continuation of a conversation that goes about 10 years now from when he first got here. I've talked to him several times for the NewsHour, many more times privately. He's a fascinating guy. He's doing extraordinary things. You all know the background, so I won't even go into the bios. I think you have them. Suffice it to say, both in terms of what he does at the Kennedy Center, but even more what we can talk about today, the questions for arts management, the arts generally in the United States and worldwide. He's at the forefront, so it always makes it interesting to talk to him. I want to start with this book. And actually, at the beginning of this book, you mentioned that for you it goes back to your own experience as a member of the board, of a board. So that's a nice way of sort of introducing some of your history.
Sure.
How did it start?
I started on the board of the Washington, at that time Washington Opera, now Washington National Opera, in 1983. Chris Hunter, who was the chairman at the time, asked me to join the board. And it was a great honor. I was a management consultant at the time, and I was working with large corporations, helping them with their strategic planning. And at that moment, the opera was applying for a challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. We loved those times of the challenge grants. We missed them. And one of the requirements of the challenge grant was that you had to have a strategic plan, which the opera didn't have. So they asked me if I would write one. And I was very pleased to do that. And I found myself getting more and more and more involved with the work of the opera. And I became the worst board member in the history of the world because I really wanted to be a staff person. And there are different roles for board and staff, and I didn't quite appreciate it, and I was very young and very callow and very obnoxious.
So give us an example. What does a bad board member do?
They want to make every decision. Why are you doing this? Why are you casting this person? Why do you have that designer? And poor Martin Feinstein, who was just a wonderful human being and a truly knowledgeable person and taught me so much, he just put up with every one of my horrible questions. And when I later on, years later, when I was given the job running the Royal Opera House, my first letter of congratulations came from Martin, in which he said, "I remember all the questions you used to ask," which was very sweet of him. But I realized through this process that I really wanted to be a staff person. I didn't want to be a board member. And it is different kind of skills and different kind of participation. And so I sold my business to my business partner, and I looked for a job in the arts. And so literally my arts management experience goes back to the Washington Opera, and it's come full circle because, as I think most of you know now, we have just agreed to an affiliation between the Kennedy Center and the Washington National Opera. So now I'm back finally running the Washington National Opera, which is something I've wanted to do since 1983.
Now, I should have said before, and looking around the room, there's so many of you that have experience in this world, that not only interest, but real experience. So we're going to talk for a bit, and then I want to open it up and make this as much of a conversation as possible. But so you look at that experience, and you look where you are now. You wrote a book. You decided it was worth writing a book about the role. What is the purpose of a nonprofit arts board?
Well, let me first say I wrote the book because I spend so much of my time training arts managers, and what you learn very quickly in this field is if no arts manager can do enough if their board isn't wonderful and happy and engaged. The board is just your best tool. And so I wrote the book because no one's training board members to be board members, and I find so many frustrated board members. And board members play, I think, 5 crucial roles in an arts organization. Number one, they have to help develop and approve the strategic plan, the planning for the organization. This is a crucial function. I find on a lot of boards, the board members do it in a rather cursory fashion. They want an executive summary, and they read it pretty quickly, and if it sort of makes sense, they approve the plan, which bothers me because if the plan of an arts organization isn't really vibrant, and particularly if the plan does not include plans for art, too many strategic plans for arts organizations involve how we're going to do fundraising, how we're going to do marketing, how we're going to develop our board, what kind of staff we need, what kind of building we need, and doesn't talk at all about the art we're going to do. I don't know how you plan those other things without talking about art. And then the board gets a little dissatisfied because they don't really believe in what's being done. So the plan is a crucial thing. The second thing is the board has to approve the budget. And again, in many, many instances, boards approve the budget if it looks like expenses are going up between 3 and 5% in total. And as long as its expenses are only going up between 3 and 5% in total, they approve the budget without really knowing whether the budget is achievable or not. And so that's the second key role. The third key role is hiring, firing, and compensating the direct reports. It might be one person, it might be an artistic director and an executive director. This is, of course, a crucial function of boards. The fourth is to participate in the fundraising process. I don't believe boards run fundraising in most cases. There are some organizations where they do. But in those organizations with professional staff, to me, it's about boards and how they participate in that process, both by their own giving, but also especially by their helping in the solicitation and cultivation of donors to the organization. And this is a crucial process. So often you read in the newspaper, this organization's in trouble because the board didn't raise the money. And to me, that's an unfair charge. Any organization, if it's said about my organization, it's because I didn't do my work rather than the board didn't do their work. It means I didn't engage the board. I didn't make it fun to fundraise. And then the fifth key role is board members.
I got to stop you because this is always, I remember the first time he said to me the fun of fundraising.
Yes, it's fun.
That stops me every time. As someone, because I travel around and I meet with all kinds of people who run museums and arts organizations, and they talk about fundraising, and it is invariably, with a sigh. I mean, there aren't that many people who find that to be fun.
Alma Gildenholm will second when I say this, that my first interviews with the Kennedy Center board, and Alma was there, I said, it's fun to fundraise. It is, because it's a transaction. It's a strategic transaction. It's not begging. If you look at it begging, it's not fun. If you realize the donor is getting something back, and the joy is finding what the donor gets for the gift and what you get in terms of the work you want to do and helping you achieve your mission, it is fun to fundraise. And then the fifth role, which is a key role, is that board members are ambassadors in the community. They really do represent the organization in the community. And this is a crucial role. And I have to say, I've just been in communities all across the country and around the world and talked with board members. And I hear board members at parties saying, oh, that board meeting was so awful, and could you believe what this person said? And I can't stand the work we did last season, and I hate our marketing. And then they want to turn around and say to the same people, will you give money to the organization? And board members play an absolutely critical role in building the impression for an organization in the greater community. And so to me, those are the key jobs of a board, and board members who do it and staff members who know how to make it fun for the board member to do those things, that's when you have a happy organization.
So if it's that clear and you can lay out the 5 pieces of it, why does it so often go wrong?
For lots of reasons. Number one, a lot of boards and a lot of staffs don't really agree on the mission of the organization. They say they do. But most mission development process, and mission is crucial in an arts organization because it's how we measure success. I always say it's so easy to be in the for-profit sector because it's in the words for profit. Everyone knows what the mission is. And General Motors and IBM and everyone can have their fancy statements in their annual report. But legally, their mission is they have to produce a profit so the stock price is high. It's for profit. In the not-for-profit world, we only know what we're not for. But what are we for? And knowing what we're for is critical because if an organization with scarce resources isn't all pushing in the same direction, you will achieve much less or nothing if everyone's going in their own direction. And yet, when we sit around to develop the mission for an organization, too often we make it very bland so everyone ends up happy. If the mission says we should be doing new work and someone says, well, I don't like new work, so they say, well, let's do good work. Oh, that's okay. And you start to create this statement that's so bland, and the mission statements for so many arts organizations basically say, we want to bring the beauty of dance to the world or something like that, which doesn't really direct an organization down a path. And then everyone in the organization, board and staff, has in their own mind a little bit different thing about what they're trying to accomplish. And when everyone's trying to accomplish something different, you end up with lots and lots of fights down the way. And so a lot of boards end up really having fights with the staff, with the artists, or with each other, when they don't really agree in what they're trying to accomplish. That's one.
Can you give us a good example from your own experience?
Sure. Royal Opera House. I was at the Royal Opera House. When I got there, we had, I think, the highest deficit in arts history of $30 million. We did ballet and opera. We were committed to doing both, and yet most of the board didn't care about ballet. They really only wanted to do opera, so they were constantly taking money out of ballet and giving it to the opera. So the ballet people were upset. So they were going to secede, which of course in England became this huge press debacle, and then the board got even madder, and then they decided the staff didn't know what they were doing, and so then they decided to have a board meeting every week for 5 hours, where, for example, one of those hours was spent where every press release to be issued by the Royal Opera House that week was given to each board member. They were each given a red pencil, and they were asked to edit the press releases. That kind of poaching, I call it poaching, when boards do work that the staff should be doing, happens when the board doesn't trust the staff. But this is unfortunately true to a lesser degree. That sounds absurd, but it was true. But to a lesser degree, it happens in so many arts organizations where the board starts to usurp the roles of the staff when they are not convinced the staff is competent. And you start this fight between board and staff that is very unproductive for the organization and leaves everyone a little bit uncomfortable and unhappy.
And you're talking about the experience in Britain, and now you've, especially in the last few years, you've traveled the world to talk. Are there commonalities internationally? Or is most of this, what you're talking about, very specific to the U.S. and Britain?
It's mostly in the U.S. It started in the U.S., Canada, Australia, because we're the three countries that really have a tradition of boards that are involved in anything but being rubber stamps for government funding. Now England is more like that. Much of Western Europe is starting to transition because as governments cut their arts funding, and virtually every government is, particularly in Europe now, as the government's cut, the British government just announced a 30% cut in their funding. The French government cuts 4 to 6% sort of each year. Italian government's cutting, German government's cutting. The wave is moving from US and going eastward. Arts organizations, as they are being given less government money, which was their major source of funding, they're now having to start to look for private funding. And one of the most important tools for developing private funding is having a warm, supportive, helpful board. And so boards are now becoming more helpful in many of these countries. So I think this pattern is moving, as I say, from America eastward. But it's going to happen in South America. It's going to happen in Asia. It's already starting to happen a little bit in China. So we're starting to see a dramatic shift in the way arts are funded, and therefore a dramatic shift in the role of the board, literally all over the world.
And before I move off this subject, I couldn't help but see in the epilogue, so it's at the very end, you talked about one of the things you've learned is that asking unproductive board members to resign is not only important, but one of the hardest things you've had to convey as you travel around to talk.
You know, arts organizations go through life cycles. We typically start very small. It's usually an artistic visionary who has an idea. They get a few friends together, often their parents form the first board or some friends, and the organization, hopefully then, if it does well, it grows and builds new funding sources and a larger board. I'll use the Alvin Ailey organization as an example. I used to run the Alvin Ailey company, and the Alvin Ailey company started in 1958, and it started with a group of friends of Alvin's who together created this wonderful organization. And the board included the people who sewed the first costumes, who drove the dancers to performances, and did all the work of staff because there was no staff. I got to the Ailey organization in 1991, which was 33 years later, and they were still mostly the board, was still the people who had sewn the first costumes, driven the dancers to the first performance, etc. Except now we were an organization with professional staff to do those activities. The board hadn't matured as the organization had matured. And one of the hardest things for a board to do is to evaluate itself and say, are we the right board for the next 10 years? Not, were we the right board for the last 10 years? And to me, I prefer calling the nominating committee the governance committee, because I believe one of the key functions of that committee is to work with board members and to talk about when it's time maybe to leave the board. And I have, in my career, asked many, many board members to leave a board, not because I didn't care about them, not because I wanted them to leave the family of the organization, but because they were no longer the right governors for the organization at that moment in history. And 90% of the time when I've asked someone to leave the board, their response is, thank you. Because they know they aren't the right board member anymore, and they are just as embarrassed to quit the board as you are embarrassed to ask them to leave. And I don't do it in a nasty way, I do it in a wonderful way, and almost always I keep them in the family. But board members, you have to evaluate what the organization needs at that moment in its history. It's not civil service. You're not entitled to be in a board for the rest of your life, is my belief.
Of course, now everybody wants to hear about the other 10%. Right?
Oh, I've had my stories. Some of them are actually fairly famous people who will never speak to me again.
Broadening out a bit, the Michael Kaiser mantra, I think you all have heard in the past, is great art, well marketed, right? Great art, is that how you put it?
Mm-hmm.
Has that changed at all over the time? Are there any caveats, any little?
It's amplified. I really now start to think of it as a cycle. For me, what makes success for any arts organization, and frankly for any not-for-profit organization, is when you do great art that reflects your mission. Really interesting, important, dynamic, exciting, challenging art. When you do that great art, and then you have to communicate about it, and if you market it very well, and I break marketing into two categories. One I call programmatic marketing. That's the marketing we're familiar with. The marketing we do to get people to come to a seminar, to come to a performance, to come to our gallery, to come to our classes. That's the programmatic. But then I talk about institutional marketing, which is the marketing we do to get people to say, this is the most exciting, dynamic arts organization in the world. When you do really great art and when you market it really well, both programmatic and institutional marketing, and here's where the new piece comes in, you build what I call your institutional family. And I think about my family being the people who give us stuff. These are our ticket buyers, our subscribers, our volunteers, our board members, our donors, the people who give to the organization. If the art's really exciting and the marketing's really dynamic, the family gets more engaged and the family gets larger and happier. And when the family's large and happy and growing and excited, they produce money. And when you take that money and, very importantly here, invest it in more great art and market it well, the family gets happier, larger, and more engaged, and they produce more money. And if you take that money and put it into more programming, and if you keep that cycle humming, that's a healthy arts organization. Unfortunately, so many arts organizations, for example, when we hit a recession, the first thing they cut when they look at their budget is programming. When I got to American Ballet Theater, which I ran from 1995 to 1998, and they were in deep trouble, they had done the same ballet, Romeo and Juliet, for 7 years in a row in their New York season. Why? Because they thought it was cheaper. They were in trouble. They had a little bit of trouble 7 years before that, so they did Romeo and Juliet again, and then they did it again, and they did it again and again. So the art wasn't very interesting, so there's nothing to market. So the family starts to go elsewhere. There's so many other opportunities for people to look for another arts organization, a hospital to work with, whatever. And then there was less money. And if you take that less money and say, oh, we better cut programming again and cut marketing again, the family gets even smaller and less interested and less engaged. And you get sicker and sicker and sicker. And every arts organization I worked with that was sick got sick for that same reason. Somewhere along the line, the decision was taken to do a little less risky programming, a little less interesting programming, and do a little less marketing attached to that. A second concern I have is oftentimes thinking of this cycle is if you do the interesting art and you do the great marketing and you build your family and you produce the money, is to take that money and not to use it for more great programming. And a lot of arts organizations take that money and decide we need an endowment. And so they take the money away. And it's not that I'm against endowments at all, but if the cycle isn't really humming, to take the money away, to take the focus away from doing more great programming is dangerous. Or we need a new building, which is even more common. You know, we need a new building. So again, we're producing a surplus. Let's take that money and put it into a building. For me, until that cycle is really going strong, till you build that huge family that's so happy and so engaged, you can't take the money away from programming because you stifle the progress. And the world is filled with organizations that have built a building when they weren't ready and end up either closed or maimed.
Well, here we are again, of course, in one of those periods. You spent a year doing your Arts in Crisis tour around the country. Were those the kinds, are you hearing the same things?
Absolutely. So many arts organizations saying, my board is forcing me to cut back on programming. I'm not saying you never have to cut back on programming. Don't hear me say that. There are lots of times you have to cut back, but it should be your last resort, not your first resort. And when you cut back on programming, what you want to do is attach it to announcing really interesting programming later on. So for example, when I got to ABT and we were basically bankrupt, and we had been doing Romeo and Juliet till we were dead, we took that out of the repertory very quickly, but I announced a huge project. We did we announced a new full-length ballet based on Shakespeare's Othello with new choreography, new music, new costumes, new sets. 3 years from then. I didn't have the money then to do it, but I needed to get people excited. And so in a recession, if you have to cut back, then think about something that you can announce that's interesting a few years hence and get people engaged by that. You don't have to do the work today for it to be interesting, but you can't look like you're just shrinking in excitement and interest.
Now, the other thing that's happening, of course, is that a lot of organizations are losing their government funding. So how does that fit in as well when they're, in terms of I guess to continue the family analogy, how do you grow that in a way that speaks to that level of funding?
My belief is that whenever any funding source is threatened, you have to be looking for new funding sources. My model is one of constantly reaching new audiences. I believe the only arts organizations are only healthy when you're constantly building the size of your family rather than holding on for dear life to those you have. And too many arts organizations are sort of holding on. And then when a government grant goes away, when a foundation grant goes away, when a major donor passes away or moves away or loses interest, all of a sudden you have nothing to hold on to anymore. And so I think we make a mistake if we count on any source of funding forever. And that means constantly building who's in our family, who cares about us, who's going to really be interested in us. And that comes from really good programming and really good institutional marketing.
All right, but let me stay on the funding issue because it's of great relevance to your organization and to mine right now.
Absolutely.
What demand exactly do or can arts organizations make on local, state, federal governments for support? I mean, what should be the right stance at a time like this?
I think we can't demand anything. Demanding doesn't work. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you view history, our country was founded by the Puritans. They thought music and dance were evil, and we've had separation.
Did they say anything about public television?
Yeah. And we've had a separation of art and state, or to put it another way, I have yet to meet a politician who's ready to risk a whole lot of their political capital on supporting the arts, which is a shame. But as a realist and as a manager, what I have to do about it is I'm not allowed to lobby in my position. I can do my education and I can do all kinds of talking, but what I can't do is let it defeat me. Because if I let it defeat me, then my organizational mission isn't being pursued. And the only job I have is to pursue the mission of the Kennedy Center. That's it. And that's what I'm being paid to do. And yes, I fight hard for my government funding. Yes, I believe there are lots of reasons why arts education, public television, important museums, et cetera, are crucial to our societies for lots and lots of reasons, economic and spiritual and educational. But I will fight for it, but I can't only rely on it, because if I only rely on it, then when we have these blips of political climates, we are going to lose our funding. And then we're dead, and that's not acceptable to me.
But what happens when you go to them and they say, okay, Michael, that's great, but there's the food bank down here, and there's the library over there, and there's the schools out here. Do you play that? I mean, I don't mean glibly to say to play that game, but I mean, Do you get into that argument, or?
I absolutely get into an argument. I mean, there's so many reasons, and almost by the nature that everyone who's here today, they already buy into the importance of our arts in our society. Otherwise, I don't think you would be here today. But we're important for so many different reasons. And I'll just talk about two today that I think are particularly critical. Number one is just our economic impact. We do employ 6 million Americans in the arts. That's not a small sector. And number two, and very importantly, our economy has changed. We are no longer a manufacturing economy. Less than 17% of our gross domestic product comes from manufacturing anymore. It's the lowest level of any of the developed countries in the world. That means that what we need as a workforce are people, young people who are educated not just to be knowledgeable, but also to be creative problem solvers and able to deal in a creative economy. Who better than the arts to help train children to start to exercise those muscles that they need in later years? I talk to so many manufacturing leaders and business leaders, and I talk about their workforce and what they need. And what they need to come out of our public schools are people who can solve problems and think creatively. And if you don't start a child feeling confident in their creative muscles very early, they're not going to feel comfortable when they're 22. We have an ability very inexpensively to do that kind of work. So yes, I get into these arguments, and I hope they're effective. But I can't rely on their being effective for the future of my organization.
Now, at a time like this, is the debate, the question of whether we have too many arts organizations a valid, important one?
You know, it's a conversation in every community I visited. I went to 69 cities around the United States last year to talk about these issues. And in every community, the question was asked, do we have too many organizations? Should some go away? And my answer to that is maybe contrarian, but my concern is that I think some of the most interesting, important arts organizations in any community are the small, diverse organizations, the avant-garde organizations, the organizations that are creating work that larger organizations sometimes can't afford to do. And if you have 2,000 seats in your theater, you can't be as risk-taking as if you have 50 seats in your theater. And I worry that when we talk about thinning out the field, what we're really talking about is getting rid of the smaller, less well-funded organizations. And my interest is to teach them how to be stronger, not to get rid of them. That said, I do believe tremendously in joint ventures between arts organizations. And I think one of the great ways to do interesting work when you don't have the resources to do something yourself is to gather lots of organizations together with different skills and resources. One of my favorite projects we did in Washington, I think it was 5 years ago, we did our Shakespeare Festival, where 65 arts organizations got together to do a Shakespeare Festival in Washington. To me, that was really wonderful, and we got a lot more, particularly the smaller organizations, got a lot more visibility in the press than they normally get. The sales were so great. We decided to start the Shakespeare Festival with a reading of Twelfth Night on Twelfth Night, January 6th, and we sort of took a risk and put it in the Kennedy Center Concert Hall, which is the largest venue in Washington with 2,400 seats. A little nervous, would anyone show up for a reading of Twelfth Night? Just a reading. And in the event, 7,000 people showed up for the reading of Twelfth Night, which showed that there was this tremendous interest, and the interest came from this community working together to do something special. So I do completely believe in joint ventures, but I don't want to see a whole lot of arts organizations go away simply because we're nervous about funding. There's a lot of money out there. The big thing we have to learn is how to do individual fundraising. Too many arts organizations, particularly smaller, less sophisticated ones, rely too heavily just on government and foundation gifts. Particularly arts organizations of color, particularly avant-garde arts organizations rely upon government and foundations. And the problem is those sources are bounded. There's only so many foundations and government agencies in a community, and only so much they will give. And what happens, therefore, is these organizations hit a ceiling. It's why there's only one arts organization of color in this country with a budget of more than $10 million, which is really an embarrassment for our country. But it has to do with where the money comes from. The vast majority of the money for the arts comes from individuals. And we have to learn how to raise money from individuals. And if we do, there's unlimited money out there for us, by the way, in every country, not just in the United States.
Let me move, you just raised the collaboration at the Kennedy Center, and I'm sure this audience probably read the recent critique in the Post from Philip Kennicott of the Kennedy Center, and that was one of the issues that he raised, the
Yep.
lack of collaboration with other arts groups in Washington.
I feel it was ill-informed. I think the Kennedy Center engages in more joint ventures than any arts organization in the world. And I'm happy to give you the list of the 100 or so that we gave to Philip that he chose to ignore. But we work with, for example, we work with a group of modern dance organizations in this community who we give resources to create new works and to perform them at the Kennedy Center. We run the Page to Stage Festival at the Kennedy Center every Memorial Day, where we have 35 local theater companies all reading new plays at the Kennedy Center. I don't want to bore you and go on and on and on and sound defensive, but I do believe that we actually lead in the field of collaboration.
The part of that critique that interested me more was that he put it as the failure to keep Washington abreast of the major innovations and trends in the performing arts world. So it's the presenting, I guess, more than innovating, more than creating.
Well, we do both. We create and we present. Yeah. We were founded as a presenting organization. Over the years, we now run a symphony. We also run now an opera company. And we run our own ballet company, Suzanne Farrell, that will celebrate its 10th anniversary. And we now produce our own theater. We had a 14-year hiatus and ended that with our Sondheim celebration in 2002. So we also have commissioned work from other organizations. I believe we are bringing a lot of new innovative art, and if any of you came to some of the presentations, for example, of our India Festival over the last 3 weeks, there was a lot of art that has never seen the shores of this country before. That's part of our mission. We did the same thing with our Arab Festival, with our Japan Festival, with our China Festival. So I really don't think that's absolutely true. What is true is that we don't bring everything to the Kennedy Center, and we can't. We simply can't afford it. But I believe we bring an awful lot that is new and innovative.
But is it a fun, I mean, just play out your thinking a little bit for us. Is it a frustration? Is it a kind of constant debate you have with yourself and your team about about bringing in the new versus the selling the tickets?
No, I don't think that's true. What is true is that we're a portfolio. The Kennedy Center is huge, and we are a portfolio. We have to serve many different communities and many different interests. And it would be inappropriate for us to only focus on what the arts police want. I think that would not be something that would be beneficial.
Who are the arts police?
Those people who really are the most interested in the most cutting edge and dismiss everything else. I can tell you I'm sitting here today because my parents took me to see The Music Man when I was 4 years old, starring Barbara Cook. And I would not be here today if she did not sing Goodnight My Someone and the scrim lit up behind her and I could see into the house, and that was the most magical moment in the history of my life. And I decided I was going to spend my whole life getting behind that scrim. I believe the musicals we produce have tremendous value for an awful lot of people. A lot of people who won't come to see, for example, next month when we have a wonderful work that's been adapted by I think the greatest theater director of all time, Peter Brook, who's coming to do 5 very, very short Beckett plays in a piece he calls Fragments. Very state-of-the-art, very cutting edge, and it will have a much smaller audience than would come to a Broadway musical. We do both. We have to do both. That's our mission. And so I don't think we fight that way at all. What we do is we look at the portfolio and say, how are we serving the multiple communities that we need to serve? And we try and create important, interesting work for all of those communities.
Well, I remember when we met 10 years ago and you took me on the terrace and you showed me what you hope to do in terms of connecting the Kennedy Center to Washington.
Right.
Now that has not happened.
That has not happened.
That must be a frustration.
I've gotten over it. That didn't happen about 6 years ago, 5 years ago. That didn't happen because when we engaged in the Iraq War, the bill that funded all highway projects, and this was ultimately a highway project, was canceled. Every non-essential highway project in America was canceled. $100 billion of projects were canceled, including our Plaza project. And so that was just a part of the world that you deal with. We turned that energy and we started to do, that's when we did the China Festival, the Japan Festival, the Arab Festival. We turned our energy to bringing some more important art to this country that normally doesn't come to this country, because we now turned our focus from that project to other projects.
So 10 years later, are you where you thought you might have been? Are you, what would be the biggest disappointment or challenge that, or unfulfilled promise 10 years later?
Well, I guess I'd have to say the Plaza Project, since it was something we talked about 10 years ago. I feel like we're on a path. I don't think about an arts organization having way station moments in its history. I think about it being a trajectory, and I think about the Kennedy Center is different than it was 10 years ago, and whether it's better now than it was 10 years ago will be judged by history, not by me. But I feel we're on a path, and I think the work we're doing in arts education, 10 years ago we were spending $5 million in arts education. This year we're spending $30 million in arts education. We work now with 11 million school children across the country, work in every state of the union, bringing arts into the classroom. We're developing a new innovative approach that's inexpensive to bring arts into the classroom, which is something I'm very passionate about. That's something you don't read about when you read a critique of programming. Our whole arts management practice is new. There was zero 10 years ago, and now we're educating literally thousands of arts managers all across this country and literally all across the world. We've now taught people from 70 countries how to run their arts organizations. I think we're playing a major cultural diplomatic role in this activity, and we're very proud of that. So I think we're making strides. We're not where I want to be. I'm our harshest critic. Philip Kennicott is not our harshest critic. I am. And we have more to do and more to grow, and we have new ideas, and we're trying. For example, I think our latest frustration is how to get 20-year-olds into the theater. You know, we unfortunately are seeing the evidence of a generation of children who did not have arts in the public schools, and they are now 20 years old. And this scares me very much, because where will the board members, donors, audience members come 20 years from now? So I believe we have remedial work to do. So we've just announced a major initiative funded by my chairman, David Rubenstein, to start to bring 20-year-olds back into the theater. It's a very serious effort by us, in multi-dimensional effort to start to bring 20-year-olds into our theaters. We're just starting that now. So where that will lead 5, 10 years from now, I can't tell you, but I hope it leads to a place that we've really experimented and taught the field how to do this. So I believe we're on a trajectory. I don't believe we're at an end point.
All right, well, maybe this is a good time to open things up. I've got a lot of other questions, but I'd love to hear, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is Pablo Halpern from Arena Stage.
Hi.
What is your take on dynamic pricing for nonprofit institutions? Dynamic pricing, demand pricing, yield management, however
I think it's inevitable. It's happening everywhere else. It's dynamic pricing or value pricing is when the tickets start selling out, you raise your prices. I have a particular view about ticket pricing, which is, and you can read about it in the book. You know, we learn in economics that there's a demand curve, that the higher the price, the lower the demand, and the lower the price, the higher the demand. In the arts, we are a kind of industry that has what's called a kinked demand curve, which is, instead of it being a straight line, it goes sort of like this, where there's a kink in it. That is, your highest priced ticket buyers tend to be very price insensitive. So the people who buy $100 tickets will also buy $120 tickets. And that's what the airlines have figured out, and that's what Broadway has figured out. And you leave money on the table if you're too worried about what your highest price ticket is. Your lower price ticket buyers are very price sensitive. And so if you're interested in a diverse audience, as I am, then you want to be careful to make sure that your pricing at the lower end stays as low as possible. But you can have a little bit more flexibility in the top end. And so when we do demand pricing, it's always in the top price ticket.
Is that something you're thinking of or looking at Arena?
We're doing aggressively dynamic pricing.
Yeah.
We're doing dynamic pricing aggressively, and it's very contentious because it's in some way it pushes the organization to for-profit programming.
Right.
Well, it's a question of motive. If your motive is profit, then it's for profit. If your motive is, how do I get the maximum amount of money so I can allow those who can't afford to come to the theater into the theater, I don't think of it as a for-profit motive. I think of it as, how am I fulfilling my mission, which is to have a diverse audience. which is our mission. That's our stated mission.
But you can see why it would raise tensions, right?
It
So
does
when
raise
we're sitting on
tensions.
the plane next to the person that paid a lot less than you paid, then you,
Absolutely.
I know that annoys me. Yes. Let's get the microphone.
Jerome Barry, I direct the Embassy series. We've been in existence for about 17 years, and I've experienced, Michael, a lot of the things that you have said. And I really believe strongly that programming has to really take precedence. We're in the business of doing the arts, but the problem is that sometimes it's difficult to tie businesses together so that we can properly remunerate the artists and really make it a very special experience. I think Washington is a little different than New York. And in order for us to raise funds and to have an expensive grant writer, that takes funding. So you have the chicken and the egg.
It's a chicken or egg problem, absolutely. And Washington is different from New York, particularly because we're a lot smaller. And we have we're just fewer people. But I find that we have a very educated audience. We have our portion of our audience that's adventuresome. We have our portion of our audience that wants more accessible art. It's just each portion's a little smaller than working in New York. My response is, what I think is the big difference for organizations that get over that chicken and egg problem is the institutional marketing component. Let me just describe it, if I could, for a minute, what I mean by that. Again, institutional marketing is the marketing we do to get people excited about who we are. And I'll give an example from the Alvin Ailey organization, just as an example of what I mean. When I got to Alvin Ailey in 1991, we were going bankrupt, and we were all sort of surprised because we thought we were so famous, and why wouldn't people give us more money? And then, shortly after I got there, the author Alex Haley died. You know Alex Haley is the author of the book Roots. He died, and we got thousands of letters of condolence because people thought Alex Haley was Alvin Ailey. And that told us that even though we thought we were famous, people really didn't know who we were. They just sort of knew our name a little bit in their mind. So I embarked on a one-year program to change the way we were pursued. And I'm just going to go through it very quickly. It started in December of 1992 when we got on the Phil Donahue show. Phil Donahue, remember, was a person before Oprah. And 18 million people saw our artistic director, Judith Jamison, speak, and saw our dancers dance. The next month was President Clinton's first inauguration, and we wormed our way into this gala that was happening the night before with Michael Jackson and Barbra Streisand and Fleetwood Mac and Aretha Franklin and all these famous people, and we danced. And 88 million people saw that on CBS. And 2 months later, in March of '93, we did a big exhibition at the Smithsonian about the history of the Ailey organization, and that got press. And in July of that year, we did a big free concert in Central Park, and CNN covered it and ran a little section every half hour for 24 hours about the Ailey concert in Central Park. And the next month, in August, Mayor Giuliani, the mayor of New York at the time, named our street Alvin Ailey Place, and there was press about that. And in November of that year, 2 books were published about the organization. And in December of that year, exactly a year after Donahue, we did our 35th anniversary gala with Al Jarreau and Dionne Warwick and Jesse Norman and Maya Angelou and Denzel Washington all participating. Everywhere you turned around for those 12 months, there was Ailey doing something very exciting and interesting and engaging. Our fundraising was $1.7 million the year before we did this program, and $3.4 million the year we did this program. They'd exactly doubled from one year to the next. Why? Because people wanted to be part of our family. By the way, none of those things cost us a penny. They were all paid for by someone else. But our family was growing. And to get back to the book, our board was engaged and excited by all of this institutional marketing. When I got to Ailey in 1991 and we were going bankrupt, I went to each board member saying, who do you know who can help us? Who can give us some money? Who are your friends? And the astonishing thing was not one of my board members had ever met another human being. And they knew nobody. And then, now 2 years later, when all this institutional marketing is going on, all of a sudden they'd all made so many friends and that they wanted to bring into our family. Why? Because they were proud of our organization. They hadn't been proud of us, now they were. And this concept of institutional marketing can be pursued by any organization at any level. Absolutely true. Small organizations can't do a presidential gala. You don't have to do that. I can give you examples from all size organizations that have done institutional marketing and make it exciting and interesting to participate in the organization, build the donor base so you have the money for the grant writer, but you don't start that way. My first job in the arts was the Kansas City Ballet. We had no grant writer. I was the executive director, I was the grants writer, I was the marketing director, and I was the secretary. But we did enough institutional marketing there to get the community really excited about who we were, so a year later we had the money for the grant writer. That institutional marketing piece, to me, is the hidden secret of running an arts organization that I find too many arts organizations just don't pursue.
Yes, in the way back.
Hi, I'm Sunny Sumter with the DC Jazz Festival, and thank you, Michael, for your book. It's been tremendous, and we have 2 members of our board that are here, and one, I know Marcia Mayo, has read your book. It's really phenomenal, so thank you. And what I love about it is that you use a lot of the examples of institutions where you've worked, so it's a really practical book, so thank you. My question is about our board, and we have moved from a strategic thinking board to a give or get board, and that's been a real challenge for us. I think we've won, but what is your assessment, given what you said a little earlier, about boards being a fundraising board and actually not having board members on the board that are strategic thinkers unless they're giving?
I want board members who are strategic thinkers, and I don't believe necessarily everyone has to give cash. I believe everyone on a board has to do something truly contributive to the organization. That can be lots of different things. It can be doing your bookkeeping. It can be helping to produce your marketing campaign. There are many things board members can and do that may not be a specific financial contribution. And I have no problem with that. But I don't believe that someone is just on your board and they represent the Latino community and that's their giving. To me, that's not enough. And so someone actually has to do something. So I want my board members to be strategic thinkers and to be helpful in the fundraising. And the technique that I found the most useful to marry the two is not to treat a board as a monolithic whole. That is, the board. The board does this, the board does that. I don't think about my boards that way. I think about my board made up of individuals. And each individual, I try and get involved in something that's interesting to them, something that's meaningful to them. And my favorite thing is if each board person becomes the godparent to one of our projects. Something we're planning. It could be this year, it could be next year, the year after, because I do my artistic planning 5 years out. And I like it when a board member says, this project's really interesting to me. And then if I can get a board member to say, I love what you're doing 3 years from now. I love this jazz program you're creating 3 years from now. I love it. I try and get them involved. I let them meet the artist, to understand what's going on, to participate in meetings. They naturally start to bring their friends because they want that project to be successful. And when they do that, they're fundraising and they don't even know they're fundraising. And when different members of your board have embraced different projects, now you have a board that's really embracing your mission. It's not that any one person is embracing every piece of your mission. It's that different people are embracing different parts of your mission, and your board meetings can be livelier because people are actually excited by the different things that they're championing.
Yes, sir.
Alan Fern, at Smithsonian. Just to follow up on that, how do you keep the board now engaged in this project from micromanaging it?
Because you set rules. Because they're just rules that says you do this and you don't do that. And this is part of having a big family. If you have a very big family, then angering one donor, one board member isn't going to kill you. But I believe in rules in an organization because I think you have to set standards for how your organization is going to behave. And if a board member or any donor thinks they are going to choose your art or become that involved in any one project, then you have a challenge as an organization. My way of working is a little bit different. I have 5 years of projects in my mind. So when I meet a donor or I'm talking to a board member and they tell me what their interests are, instead of creating a project to make them happy, what I'm doing is I'm picking from what I call my menu, which is my 5 years of projects, that project which I think they will be most interested in. But the project doesn't come from the donor or from the board member. It comes from the professionals who are meant to be planning the art.
Miss in the back corner.
Hi, Barbara Buchanan. I am not in arts management, but I have 20 years in nonprofit management and now in sort of an artist myself in composing. But I also spent 10 years in the corporate world, and I find a tremendous difference between the boards of directors in corporations, boards of directors in nonprofits. And once I joined the corporate world, I realized why we were having so much trouble managing our nonprofit board. We simply didn't quite get that they were used to a different presentation, a different level of information than we were giving them in the nonprofit world. Huge difference, and I found every CEO or corporate member of our nonprofit board just didn't know what to do. They were fish out of water. So I appreciate your book. But is the sequel to the book the management side? Because what I hear you saying and what you're so successful at is you as the manager, the executive director, the CEO managing your board of directors. And I know you do have a great arts management program at Kennedy Center, and there's some schools around the nation too. But I think it's that training of the CEOs, where to draw the lines, where not to let the board micromanage. Can you just speak a little bit to that CEO
Sure.
side?
We spend a lot of time, and in fact, that was really the prequel to this book. I spend so much time, writing books about this topic, but also teaching arts leaders around the country and around the world. We now have programs here in Washington, in New York, in Chicago, in Grand Rapids, in Detroit, in Orlando, and Miami, and about to start one in Los Angeles. So we're really sort of covering the country and training the managers themselves on these particular issues. But for me, it's not, the line drawing isn't so hard. I don't think most of my board members of my organizations would say, Michael sets this really hard rule and we can't penetrate it. I think it's more about making it fun and exciting to participate in an organization and to keep the art interesting and to be able to talk about the work you're planning not just this year, but next year and the year after and the year after. And most arts organizations, particularly those that are doing shorter seasons or smaller seasons, I'm not talking about the Kennedy Center, but if you have a ballet company doing 3 dances a year, if you have a theater company doing 5 productions a year, that if you only can talk about that, it's very hard to build a sense of excitement. One of the reasons for talking about art multiple years out is getting people really interested. And I agree, boards of not-for-profits are very different from corporate boards for lots of reasons. One is corporate boards are paid, not-for-profit boards have to pay for the privilege. And that puts extra pressure on us as staff of not-for-profits to make it fun and engaging and to make it feel like the board members are getting something back for their participation because they're certainly not being paid.
You can plug your earlier book, right? The Art of the Turnaround.
Right.
Some of it's in there. Yes, sir.
Al Milliken, AM Media, and I've done part-time work with the American Film Institute since it was at the Kennedy Center. I wanted to ask about 2 of your long-term relationships. One, the American Film Institute that you no longer have relationship with, and also the long-running popular show Sheer Madness. How do you personally evaluate those
Sure.
relationships?
AFI chose to build its own building, which is fantastic. We're thrilled about that. For a couple of years, we used that space that they occupied at the Kennedy Center to house theater companies in Washington that had no place to be and were building. So we had Woolly Mammoth with us for a couple of years. We had ATCO with us for a couple of years. We had Cinetic Theater with us for a couple of years. And then we decided to build a theater specifically for our work for children, since we do so much. And if you haven't seen the Family Theater, it's really quite a beautiful theater. It doesn't look like a children's theater, just every seat is good. We still do a good amount of film at the Kennedy Center, but that was AFI's decision to build its own building, and we're thrilled when other organizations go out and are so successful. Sheer Madness. Sheer Madness is a wonderful introduction to theater for a whole lot of kids who come here on tour every spring. But more importantly for me as a manager, Sheer Madness produces for us $750,000, which goes right into our education programs. We wouldn't be able to do the work we do in the public schools around this country if we didn't have that revenue. And again, as I said, we are a portfolio. We do lots of different things. And certain things make us money, which allow us to put that money into the programming for which we don't have a sponsor. As I think all of you know, we do a free performance every day of the year. Those are not inexpensive to produce. So we have to have those productions, like Wicked will be this summer, that produces a good deal of revenue for us that goes right into the free programming and to the educational programming of the Kennedy Center.
Yes.
Thomas Beveridge. I'm the artistic director of the New Dominion Chorale, which is the largest chorus in Washington, 250 singers. There was an interesting review this morning of a chorus that started off by saying that there are way too many amateur choruses in Washington. I wanted to just briefly tell you about a success story. I figured out 20 years ago when I founded this organization that the principal thing that a board would do would be to raise money for a staff. So we decided to call this a singers cooperative. We operate, I'm the artistic director, I'm also the executive director, and the board consists only of people from the chorus. And it revolves every 3 years. You cannot, even the treasurer has to get off the board. And we have sailed through this recession very nicely.
It's great. And there are many organizations around the country who've done that. After Hurricane Katrina, we decided we had to do something for the people of New Orleans. And so what we decided to do was to adopt an organization that we thought was threatened. And so we studied the field and decided that their orchestra was most threatened, the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra. That also is an organization that is a cooperative. It's now a hybrid, but it started as a cooperative where all of the board and all the board officers were musicians in the orchestra. And the good news is they were the only organization to show a surplus the year of Hurricane Katrina, which was a little bit embarrassing. But they raised an awful lot of money that year, which is great. So it's a model that works for a lot of arts organizations. It doesn't work necessarily for all arts organizations. I don't believe there are too many amateur choruses here. And in fact, I've already announced a project that we're planning to do in 2014, which will be my last year as president of the Kennedy Center, which is a chorus festival of choruses from around the country coming to perform, but then to create the largest chorus, including the local choruses, in Verizon Center, and to do just this mammoth choral concert with the National Symphony Orchestra and choruses from all over. We would like to have 10,000 choristers. So we hope you'll be there with your group.
Are they singing goodbye to you? Is that the idea?
No. It has nothing to do with me. I believe tremendously in choral music. Washington is a choral center for this country. And I believe that we need to pursue that art form and really put a spotlight on it in a way that I don't think has been done.
Yes, right here. Here comes the microphone.
I'm Sylvia De Leon, and I'm the chair of the Washington Ballet. I'm here with Frank Loy, who's the vice chair. And I will say, when I first became chair, one of the first things I did was to invite Michael to come address our board. And
we had a good Saturday morning.
He devoted his longer than a Saturday morning, but you set us on a new direction, and we quote you many times. You had a very significant impact on the direction that I've tried to lead the board. I have two quick questions. The other side of the coin of poaching, as you say, and micromanaging, as everyone often says, is accountability and transparency. And so I would be interested to have any comments that you have on that point of really sort of walking that.
For board members or for staff members?
For board members. For board members.
I think it's very important for there to be both accountability and transparency, but it's embarrassing to do that in a large public forum. And that's where I believe, why I mentioned earlier, I believe a nominating committee is better served to be called a governance committee. And I'm a very big believer in arts organizations having personal report cards that board members write for themselves.
Yeah. And for management, really the accountability and transparency of management, just day-to-day transparency.
Same thing, really. And I believe the board's responsibilities were the direct reports to the board as opposed to every staff member. But part of how you evaluate the leadership of your organization has to be how they handle their other staff and their selection, their motivation, the way they compensate, et cetera. Yeah. I think it's crucial.
My second quick question really is about your comment on endowment. And when you get to that point where you know you're on an upward trajectory, but you want to keep investing in the product, but everyone's crying out for endowment, the issue often becomes contingency funds. And so in an annual budget discussion, the issue is how much do you then start to set aside for those rainy days that you have every year?
I budget for failure. You know, I believe we're in a field where you have failure. If you never have a failure, then you haven't taken enough risk. And so I create a failure fund, essentially. We don't call it that in our accounting, but that's what it is. And that is a contingency for the organization that allows us to cover what could go wrong. And if things don't go wrong, snow for Nutcracker, a bad production, or critics not liking a production, or the audience not liking a production, or whatever. And I do budget for that every year because I don't do deficits. I don't believe deficits are healthy. But can I get to the endowment point for a second?
Yeah,
my favorite thing. I love endowments, and if someone gives me endowment, I'm deeply, deeply grateful. But a lot of boards will do anything they can to reduce in their minds annual fundraising. The notion that anything we can do to have to raise less is a good thing. And I think there's a lot of reasons why people like endowments. Well, if we have a big endowment, we won't have to do so much fundraising. But I have yet to see an organization that gets or builds an endowment where the total budget size just doesn't grow. Because not-for-profit organizations are mission-driven, and therefore we all grow to the point that we're uncomfortable. We always want to do a little more and a little more and a little more because we love what we do. We love the role we play in our community. And so we constantly want to do more. So if someone gives us a big endowment, we're just going to want to do more than that. So all of a sudden, we still have to raise the same amount we did. We just have a bigger budget in total. I don't think endowments really reduce the annual fundraising requirement for any arts organization I've ever seen. If the founders of Harvard University could have seen the endowment now and imagined what they would have done then, they would have said, oh my God, this is the biggest thing ever. When the Getty Museum was formed in our lifetime with $1 billion of endowment, and we all thought, oh my goodness, and I believe now it's $6 billion or $8 billion, and we all say, this is more than anyone could ever want. They're still laying off people this year. Because what we do is we keep wanting to do more and do more and do more. So the notion that endowment's going to reduce our annual fundraising requirement just doesn't happen. It sounds good, it doesn't happen.
National Endowment for the Humanities. You mentioned institutional marketing beforehand, and as government agencies, the NEH and the NEA, we can't really engage in that, but we need it. And the situation in Congress now and in previous Congresses, we stand at the top of the list of organizations to be zeroed out. And I don't think it's going to happen, but we're going to take a big hit. What would your advice be to improve the situation?
I'll give my advice, and you might not agree with it, and that's fine. I really believe we've had, at least my entire career in the arts, which is 26 years, I think we've made a big mistake when we sell the arts to the public and to Congress, which is we always bring the richest people to testify before Congress and say the arts are great. We bring Oprah Winfrey, Yo-Yo Ma, whoever else to come and talk about why the arts need support. No one on TV watches Oprah Winfrey and says, why should we give money to the arts? She's so rich already. I really think we've done ourselves a disservice by not exposing the public to the thousands of arts organizations that serve the underserved, that work with black children in our inner cities, that work with the Latino populations, the ones that are doing really interesting grassroots with rural populations. One of the great things of my tour last year is I got to go to Pierre, South Dakota, and to Bismarck, North Dakota, and to Boise, Idaho, and to see what more rural communities were doing in the arts and the tremendous importance. When I went to Pierre, South Dakota, many of the people there drove 6 hours each way to come to this session that I did, my hour-and-a-half session, because they were so passionate about the role of the arts in their communities. We've created the notion that we're of the elite. We're not of the elite. We serve people of every spectrum, of every background. But then we bring only the richest, most famous artists to testify or to perform in the White House. And we create this notion that the arts really are this small group of very privileged people. And I think we have to fight that. We have to change the way we promote the arts in the public sector.
Well, amen. I see that myself when I travel around. You said Boise, I was there last year. You said, well, wherever. I mean, you see this wherever you go. You see it in small organizations, and that's where the art is and art needs to be, and same is true in my world as well. So I think this is time to, whoa, one more question? Go ahead. Here comes.
I'm Alma Gildenhorn. I'm
She's
an
a shill.
honorary
We have to-
trustee.
I mean, she announced herself to us as a shill before
Right.
it started, so when her hand went up, I have to call her. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
I guess I'm a cheerleader for the Kennedy Center. I've been involved with the center since the early 80s, and I have the privilege of being an honorary trustee at this point. Institutions evolve, and it's been interesting the way the Kennedy Center has evolved. And as a board member and as a lover of the arts and a great fan of the Kennedy Center in general, I know I speak for all of the members of our board and of the administration who are here today to say that we owe so much to Michael Kaiser, because what he preaches around the country and around the world, we have been the beneficiaries of since the very moment he arrived. And even every performance at that center has a reason, and that's to serve the public. I think we're the only institution in this city that still has sightseers. The doors are open to tour buses until 11 o'clock at night. Michael mentioned briefly the Millennium Stage, which goes on 365 days of the year. And that makes the center the least elitist venue, I think, in this country, because everyone is invited to attend. And for the families that don't have the privilege to run to New York with 5 or 6 children or 5 or 6 people and to pay the fare and to spend 3 or 4 days there and see Broadway shows, we make it available, this great American art form of musical theater, to be right here at our front doors, in addition to everything else that Michael mentioned. I don't want to go on, but I want to express our gratitude to Michael Kaiser and the fabulous staff that he has led, and long may his success continue.
Thank you, Alma.
Thank you for that, and thank Aspen again for having me here, and most of all, thank you all for coming, and most of all, thank you to Michael Kaiser.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much.